Start off right off the bat with quantum dice rolling. We're going to talk about the specific paradigm that this is going to represent, because it changes not only this game but your perspective on dice in the main. I don't say it glibly, but there is a distinct difference between people. You know, if you go back and look at the history of the bottled water business, and this is where I take my teeth out and do the old man routine of, back in my day, people drank water from hoses and didn't have to go and buy a bottle of water. It's just crazy. People are spending money to buy bottles of water now. It's all newfangled. Well, in just such a fashion, once you have a grip on quantum dice rolling, you won't look at any dice rolling games the same in the future. So, just preparing you that it does change the way you perceive of dice rolling once you see this other alternative. So, we're going to go into that in particular. As a matter of fact, we will do something newfangled, and I will change the scene to a secondary scene where I can walk you through the numbers part of it a little bit more clearly. The last couple of times I've tried to describe it have been sort of wordy. I have to say, I found that I talk way too much. I'm being honest here. If you're watching this for the first time, you probably aren't even aware of it yet, and you may have already decided you're going to click off because I talk too much. So we're going to get to quantum dice rolling. Then we're going to talk about classless role-playing, and I don't mean a game role-playing where nobody has any class. What I'm referring to is the concept of playing in a game environment where class is irrelevant. That the concept of what you do as a occupation is not associated with your identity. It's going to be a change in the way we are looking at the game, and that's radically different from other systems that are out there. Then we're also getting rid of hit points. And just saying that sounds like anathema. You know, that's like saying get rid of cars on the road. And it's innovative, but it's not as groundbreaking as that might seem. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the second Genesis and why there are 35 different races, species in NycosRPG. So there's a considerable amount of, if you will, comparative genetic drift that allows for a broader spectrum of character races, and this is specifically talking about species, to play and what that second Genesis is. Then we're going to talk about defining skills by their utility and purpose. And that's not porpoise, that's purpose. And let me get this. Again, I've got to move things around on the screen. Didn't realize it had run off the edge there. And therefore talking about skills not only in the concept of what they are, but what they can be used for and how they can be adjusted or altered and things like that to make them more than just simple naming nomenclature, naming convention. And then, as usual, when we get near the end of the show, I'll talk about how you can get your own copy of the NycosRPG Dark Shards Systembook, the PDF, absolutely free. And so I'll bring you the details on that here at the end of the show. In between then and now, I want to thank you again for being here. We're going to be talking about a lot of stuff here. If at any point you're viewing this and you're not getting it or understanding it, if you're here live during the show on Twitch, which is at twitch.tv/NycosRPG, feel free to go ahead and hop right into the chat channel, ask your question, present your opinion or whatever, and we will respond directly with you. If you are viewing this via YouTube later and are not able to directly comment, make sure that you leave me a comment on the comments section down below, and I will be glad to respond to that there as well. And make sure in either case, if you can, go ahead and subscribe to the show so you'll get every update when they come out, because it's important that we get this information out to you on all the new stuff that's as it's rolling out. And so this is just one of the earliest pieces of that puzzle. So going back to the original question, which is quantum dice rolling. What is quantum dice rolling? Well, dice rolling with a quantum relevance is considering a die roll to not produce only one answer, as we have come to believe, but that a die roll can produce multiple answers or multiple resolutions. So I'm going to be switching the channel here to show you what this means. So let's go over here. And now, the reason to have these different bracketed tiers is so that you can, with a single die roll, decide whether the player has completely succeeded at whatever plan he had, if the player has succeeded partially, or if he's done way beyond what was expected and done even better. And so by having a graduated die roll, utilizing those double up and double down values, you create a window of success, not just a single point threshold. I don't know how many of you have played role-play games, but I know from talking with players, one of the most frustrating things that can happen in a game is to have an enemy that has an armor class of, say, 18, and they spend the night with all their modifiers getting to 17s over and again, but they don't seem like that gets anywhere because that's an absolute fail, because it didn't make it. So this mechanism that allows for an opening of that gap to give some place for partial success, you're actually giving your players a little bit more theatrical space to be in their heads when it comes to handling whether they succeed or fail. It's a lot more palatable to think that you partially succeeded than it is to just simply say, well, I blew it again. And this is particularly of note when you are in a bam situation where one person's swinging and then the other person is swinging and then the first person swings and then the second person. That slog is interminable and is made worse with the fact that any miss, even a really close die roll, doesn't give it any gravitas. So by having a partial under the quantum die rolling system, it gives you a bit more leeway to be comparative in your narrative. See what I did there? So by being able to be comparative in your narrative, you can say this person did slightly better than that person. This person's hit was a little more solid. That person's attack was a little off kilter. And therefore you've got more graduation of relevancy between the players and their enemies. So quantum dice rolling is the first thing that's majorly different, and that is that every combat sequence literally comes down to rolling dice until somebody fails. And if both persons fail, the conflict isn't necessarily over, but both of them are able to, at that moment, decide whether they want to break it off or not, because there's a break in the action. So this concept of rolling dice until you lose a pile of hit points is now no longer a problem, because you don't worry about relative health. Now, are there ways to do injuries? Yes. Are there ways to cause wounds? Yes. And we'll get more into that a little bit later in possibly a different portion of the video. But the quantum die rolling mechanism just simply makes it so there's a graduation of effort so that the GM can be more cinematic in his description, and the players can feel more agency in their actions during the round. Okay, so now we're going to come to the second point, which is classless role-playing. And I had a difficulty when we were first when I was first looking at playing a role-play game that didn't have a class, because for all of the time that I played, going back to the 1970s, back in my day, your class mattered, and you had to have a good class, or else your character wasn't going to be worth anything. So, pardon my old man accent there. But the point is that a role-playing game was, at that point, defined by the fact that there were classes involved. Now, those who were playing role-play games that were coming from a military background understood what they meant when they said classes in terms of conflict types. So, for example, in a miniatures game or a chit-based war game, you will have tokens that represent infantry. You'll have different tokens, different shapes and colors of tokens that represent artillery or aircraft or helicopters or go on and on. But those classes of weapons or classes of military units was necessary so that you could graduate the combat appropriately. You would know, if I need to take on an Air Force, I need to have so many Air Force units, or at least people that can handle archery weapons and such. And so by having class involved, it was having class involved on the wargame side led to it being necessary in the role-playing side, because there were too many distinctions that you couldn't just have anybody performing any action willy-nilly. That defied the structure. So, therefore, when we talk about classless role-playing, what we're actually referring to is starting to role-play in an environment that feels more like real life, in that you don't have to have a particular class to learn certain skills. You can find somebody who will teach you and pick up virtually any skill that you want. And that includes the concept of spellcasting. If you, and I don't use the term spellcasting, but if you wish to be a magi and you want to create magical effects, you can learn how to do those effects from whichever practitioners there are that can do that effect. And so in certain cases it will be because of their religious order and pantheon. Maybe it's because of their training regimen and materials they have access to. Maybe it's by sheer will and determination and physical prowess. I mean, these are all ways that these effects could be generated, but there's no requirement to be of a certain caste or a certain group of people to be able to do this. And this opening, therefore, allows for the characters to be more, if you will, normalized. You know, you may have a desire to pick up some form of medicinal or healing capability, but you don't want to go into the whole religious ritual. Well, certainly you can learn some of the basics of first aid, but that training isn't necessarily going to be religious or moral in aspect or in action. And so therefore there are ways you can gain and utilize those skills that you received from other sources than a class kit, so to speak. A second aspect of this is that the concept of role-playing means that if you run into somebody who has a certain attribute or skill, I actually shouldn't say attribute, has a certain skill base, and you want to learn from them, there are means for you to assist them in order to improve your training, and in the process acknowledge their advancements in the skills so far. So it becomes a logical extension of who you as a player are. Furthermore, in the longer term, it actually creates a potential occupation stream for characters within the fantasy realm to generate revenue. They can actually become teachers and advocate for their particular specialties that they have advanced. And there's real rules as far as how that works or whatever, but the point is that it's relatively easy to adjudicate, and it allows players to have reasons to interact with others in and out of game. So now, having said that, what does classless role-playing feel like? Well, it feels more conversational. Your character's interaction is just simply going to be on the basis of where you are, who else is there, and why they're there. And getting the conversation going is going to be just as difficult as in real life, and yet it will allow players to develop real-time skill in those methodologies by requiring them to role-play through it. I know it sounds crazy to have role-playing actually being participated in as a process of a role-playing game, but that's what this engine is for. So now we're going to come to the kind of the elephant in the room, and that is getting rid of hit points. Everybody and their brother that I've ever talked to about this issue tries to see it in the same way, and they fundamentally say, you can call me Ray, or you can call me Jay, or you can call me Johnny. You can call me Mr. Ray J. You can call me Ray J. Johnson. You can call me Miss Johnson, but you doesn't have to call me Mr. Johnson. And the point here is, most people think that in role-playing games, hit points are hit points are hit points, and therefore there's not a way to avoid them or ignore them or remove them because they have become so intrinsic to the way role-play games are played. But I'm here to tell you that the purpose and intent of role-playing games in their inception in the 60s and 70s was to find ways to resolve conflict in such a way that it would emulate the way we actually won World War II. The concept of having a pool of points in any form that the opponent must remove to force you to reduce your actions to zero is, in fact, just an extension of the war-fighting tactics of World War II. We fought the Germans until we took away their ability for war-fighting. And once we took away their ability to fight wars and took away their allies' abilities to fight wars, and created a weapon that could devastate either of them if they didn't comply, the war is ended. And so we learned that therefore we can win the war by this process of attrition. And so all games from then until now, even newer games like New World, which had its troubles, or you name the game, they all have a pool of hit points / mana points, and they have a certain pool of energy points or magic points, and you only are eliminated, dead in the game, if you will, if you lose one or both of those pools. And that mechanism is antiquated. If instead you look at it from the standpoint of relative positioning and as a measure of the pressure within the system, then it becomes more focused and intentional. Players have to consider what amount of pressure can they still bring to bear, and how soon are they going to lose their ability to produce it. So hit points become a barometer or a running total, and it's somewhere between 95% and 5% operational at any given time. And the more actions that you take, the fewer, the more fatigue you're burning up, so that you can actually burn yourself out in only a few turns if you're not careful. Getting rid of the hit points, though, does a couple things. Number one is it makes the concept of elimination more visceral. When you know you've got a pool of hit points to lean back on, it's pretty easy to be arrogant and talk trash to villains. But if you only knew that they were already 2 dice rolls ahead of you and had an advantage on the next one, you may consider your strategy. So the idea, therefore, is to get rid of the hit points, leave the players with a clear understanding of what they can do to resolve the conflict, and then pledge you and the group's intent to overcoming those challenges and achieving that goal before you become so fatigued that you can't. Furthermore, by having that liberty of the extra pool points making you feel invulnerable, it leads to more effective and more realistic role play, because you start being considerate about whether or not you're going to be removed from play, so to speak, instead of just simply glibly hoping that your dice rolls will hold you steady. So, next question. What is the next Genesis, or the second Genesis? Well, In the early days of Dungeons and Dragons, the worlds were almost exclusively fantasy based in the realm of Tolkien, and so the creatures and beasts and such were those of present canon and written lore concerning periods up to the end of the Roman era, maybe a little further. But the real challenge is that by having that as your limit, then when you come to including new stories and finding new sources for story, you restrict their effectiveness because players cannot take advantage of the benefits thereof. So that's the reason why the GM soapbox is set up so that it's within the framework of this show so that we can limit its functionality and therefore make it so that the species make sense because they are within that same framework. So the second Genesis, which included all these new species, was made possible because the players demanded it. And it became a rational explanation for how that occurred. And once that occurred, then now you have a fundamentally runaway series of possible species. And by having that runaway possible group of species, you have more diversity within the playing group and more comfort to be something that is different or alternative. And so therefore it's a, if you will, a friendlier environment in that fashion. Now, what does it do in long term? Well, it gives some really cool special secondary abilities called marks based on what the species are. These marks are basically that which identifies them as the type that they are, and therefore they can be as dynamic and silly as they want to be within the framework of the system and still be playable. So, since the Nykos world is fundamentally a world that is of a cartoon type nature, the sec-gen beings who are fundamentally anime-based character types, archetypes, means they can all be played just perfectly fine. So that is what the second Genesis is a way to include those secondary species in a game that would fundamentally eliminate the other players automatically for not being in the right classes. So now we're going to talk about the defining of skills by utility and purpose. And what I mean by that is you can have a skill in dueling, which is sword fighting, and you can also have a skill in weapons prowess, and the two may never meet. They could, but they don't have to. And the idea here is that a weapons prowess skill means that you can show off the function of the weapon and do all kinds of things, cutting paper to shreds and putting out candles with the sword blade and such. And all of those are sword proficiency skills, but they're not practical when it comes to a fight. And so therefore defining your fighting skills in terms of the weapon makes sense, but realizing that there are skills that are defined by their purpose as well as just their utility means that there's a much wider variety of things that you can as a character do within the framework of the world. Furthermore, these defining skills in this fashion means that a player can pick some skills that are aggressive and active and specific, like disarming, so that you can actually eliminate your opponent's weapon in the turn or whatever. Or you can instead have a different skill altogether. Maybe you have a skill in displacement where you push the person back a space or whatever. These are all things that can be chosen and built on as skills, and the players and the game master work together to build this list for each one. This is for the NycosRPG, and I am Jonathan Albin, the designer of it, and we're going over the parts of the NycosRPG that are unique and different from standard role-play games like Dungeons and Dragons. I have been a game master for role-playing games going back. Yes, it is. It's absolutely tabletop. I've been GMing since 1974, 75. I learned to play when I was 11 years old at the table of Dave Arneson, one of the two guys that wrote D&D, and I've been a game master for 48 years. And so in all of that time, I've played along with all the systems that are out there. I used to work for Gamma, so I learned how to play basically every role-play game published throughout the country. And then in the last couple of years, I actually took the time as a game master, especially with the beginning in the period of COVID, to look at role play from a different dynamic, and that was what of it is actually role play and what of it is actually a tabletop game that isn't really role play. And I found that Dungeons and Dragons, as defined, has been drifting away from role play and into more of a tabletop game, and I am striving to mechanize or to simplify the mechanics of the game to make the role play aspects stand out. Oh, and you're right. You're right. There are groups that are going to be on both sides of the line, and I'm perfectly fine with that. As a matter of fact, when I devised the NycosRPG mechanism, what I was hoping to do was create it as a saddle. The idea that it could be laid over a standard Dungeons and Dragons group, and you could play with the parts that you wanted from NycosRPG along with your D&D. And welcome if you're a new GM. Bless your heart. That you're a brave soul jumping into this arena, because it's been. As a matter of fact, you're in a really good place, because in today's world there are tons of places where you can see them talking about there is a dearth, there is a dying off, there's an elimination process that is basically killing off old game masters, and there aren't enough new ones coming in. So, oh wow, three sessions. That's fast. That's funny, because I happen to be three sessions into my administration of a game that is solely within the NycosRPG. So this game developed over 8 iterations, and what I mean by that is I started playing in 74, 75, and when I started playing, I created a story arc that took 6.5 years real time to play through. Every week I played, and the story that built up took 6.5, over 6 years, almost 7 years to play through. Since then, I've played through that same system, that same story arc, a total of 8 times. As a matter of fact, last week we just finished the 8th iteration by having the great big battle with the big bad and resolving out all of the characters that were still in the game. So we are now formally starting into the 9th iteration. So I'm 3 sessions in too. So welcome. Yes. That's exactly right. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges to role-playing today is that if you're going to role-play a fictional world, if you're going to play in a fictional world, you have really one of two choices. You either pick somebody else's created world and then try to learn everything about that world, or you create your own rules mechanisms to cover the kinds of monsters you want to have in the campaign, in which case you're doing your own game world. And so I appreciate you, Strigley, for saying that's what you're considering doing. That's exactly where I was. Now, in my defense, I learned how to play, I think, 6 months before the game was published. I was only 11, so it could have been 6 months after, but it was really, really early. Exactly. You've got it, Strigley. That's exactly the point. Why learn somebody else's game world and have to know everything they know and have to learn it imperfectly, and therefore you could get caught up by a player who happens to have read something you didn't? Why do that? Why run that risk when you can just simply create your own? So I actually teach an academy. I have an academy called the Game Masters Academy, and for $47, you get an entire year of classes on that. So I just mentioned that. I'll go into the details, and if you want to know more, I will give you the link to that here in a bit. But that academy goes through all the pieces that you would want to develop on your own in a way that's homogeneous and is the kind of way that you would go about doing it anyway, but it shows you how to step by step to get all the pieces so you wouldn't miss anything. Aha! Yes. Main plot, history, quest, etc. Keep people interested. Yep, exactly. Yes, yes. Those are difficult points. The first, I think that when it comes down to that, and before I'm going to be stepping off of my agenda, so I'm just remind me, I'm almost done here. As a matter of fact, I am. Let me go ahead and finish this real quickly, Striggly, and then I'll come back. Defining skills by utility and purpose means that your skills list can be doubled in value. So every skill that a person learns can be used in more ways than they list. So, for example, a person picks up a skill in pickpocketing. Well, if you know what pickpocketing means, then pickpocketing literally means to cut the purse strings. It means to be innovative in distracting someone else while you take their stuff. That's fundamentally what pickpocketing meant. It didn't necessarily mean you were reaching into a pocket, but it meant simply that you were taking the materials away from the enemy. So a pickpocketing skill is definitely could be used as a combat skill, but as a non-combat skill to do something like that. But I'm going to give you an example in a movie, a recent movie that proves that it can be used otherwise. In Endgame, Tony Stark wrestles with the arm of why can't I remember his name? The big bad. And as he does so, he's able to liberate all the stones from the gauntlet and then incorporate them into his own wrist, and therefore was able to create the snap. That theft would have technically been a pickpocket skill, but he used it in the military, in a combat situation, to achieve something that was combat related, because they needed to get the stones away from Thanos. So that ability came into play because he had the fast hands enough to accomplish it. So that was an example of utilizing a non-combat skill within a combat setting, and vice versa. So therefore, just realize that a skill list is not only a list of skills for purposes, but is also a skills list in utility. So now, and before I get right specifically to this conversation with Striggly, I do want to say that if you want to get a copy of the NycosRPG rules, there's two ways you can do it. Right now, if you go to NycosRPG.com, and that's my website, and you go to the shop, you can purchase the PDF version of the NycosRPG rules that includes everything to do all of the above, and it explains all of the above in detail, and sets you up to run your own game world within the Nykos mechanism. That's only $10. If you go that direction, you can purchase it. But if you want to get your own copy of the Dark Shards RPG absolutely free, what you need to do is go to startplaying.games. I have an event set up for this Saturday where I'm teaching people how to play the NycosRPG, and all you have to do is subscribe to that event. Sign up for that event. There's no cost for it, but you have to subscribe to that event and then come back to this video, and come to this video and put either in the comments here on Twitch or in the YouTube ad text in the comment section there that you are going to be at the event, and that verification process will get you access to a copy of the Dark Shards RPG at no cost. I'll just literally be downloading it to you at the event for those who have done that. So if you want a copy of the rules and just want to peruse them, and it doesn't cost you any money, but it definitely gives you an opportunity to see the entire project. This is only the first of 7 books that will be coming for this property, plus an 8th master book that'll cover all of them. These things are all coming in the future, but for right now, Dark Shards is the fantasy setting, and it's available absolutely free if you register for the event on Saturday and then post back to these videos that you did so for my cross-check purposes.